Welcome everyone to Tech Week 2023. My name is Chris Claridge. I'm the chair of the Trust Alliance. We're going to be talking with some of New Zealand's cleverest people when it comes to farm data. We're going to be talking about farm data, digital, a little bit about identity, and a little bit about how we extract value from farm data generally and some of the obstacles that we're facing in the primary sector. Now with me today, I've got joining us online, we've got Sam Ragnarsson, a Principal Advisor of the Ministry for the Environment. Kia ora, Sam, welcome. And I've got joining us from Wellington, I've got Lucy Dormer, who works with MPI. Kia ora, Lucy, and welcome. And with me in the studio today, I've got Christina Finlayson. Welcome. Christine, very good to have you here today. And look, we'll start the ball rolling by addressing a question to Christine. And what we're going to ask, Christine, is you're the Enterprise Solutions Manager at Balance.
Yep.
Balance is a very large organisation, a big powerhouse in the agricultural sector. Mm-hmm. So take us a little bit through the journey about farm data that Balance has been on. What are some of the obstacles you've had with farm data, and what are some of the opportunities you see out in the future?
Cool, thanks Chris. So my role at Balance is to innovate using data, using AI, geospatial, to create new value for our farmers and solve some of their pain points. So we create digital solutions that try to make it easier for our farmers to farm. One of their frustrations is having to put data into the same place, and it might be into our system, into Fonterra or Zespri, and so that's why we really value our data integrations. So we released a tool in 2016 called My Balance, and then quickly moved into the integration space. So we integrated with a company called Precision, and then with TrackMap, and that's all around trying to close the loop on nutrient application on farm. So how much fertiliser went on a particular part of the farm, so we can make sure that the advice that we gave ended up happening on the ground.
So just walk me through some of the barriers to that data sharing and how, and what have been some of the challenges.
Yep.
And then we'll bring in our online panel participants.
Yep.
After that, if you don't mind, Lucy and Sam.
Cool. So we have integrated with several companies that I mentioned, and a few more recently using APIs, and I think we've learned a lot along the way. So initially, quite an expensive process, couple of $100,000, and quite a lot of time, generally about a year, to sort of make sure that we're talking about the same data, we're getting that data definition right, to make sure that we can actually deliver the value at the end of that data integration. So the value proposition for the customer is extremely important, making sure that we're not just sharing data between our organisations for data sharing's sake. It's actually going to solve something for the farmer and make their lives easier.
All right, thank you, Christina. Look, I'd like to bring in Sam, if I could, just to ask you a question about, just to take it up a level, if you like. Data sharing, it's important for New Zealand, but the question I'm going to pose to you is, why is data sharing important? Why do we need to share data, and how does it help farming if we share data between different organisations? Over to you, Sam.
Thanks for having me. I would say that it's very important to have data sharing in order to learn from it and to be able to actually, have less effort put into various aspects of whether it's farming or something else, so you can actually do the right thing rather than doing the wrong thing many times over. The more data that, it doesn't have to be the government, but the science institutes and others, the more accurate data and data that is collected on what is going on can hopefully be used to then make better decisions. So use data for improved decision making would be the top priority there.
And I'd like to bring Lucy Dormer in, please. Lucy, if you could answer this question around data sharing and how we enable sharing to occur in a safe manner between farms and between government agencies, because of course there is some concerns around data sharing between individual farms and government agencies. do you have a view on how we better manage data from farmers going across to government departments and government agencies?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hey, I'm trying to sort of listen in here, but ironically, I'm having some tech issues in Tech Week. Yeah, so hopefully you can all hear me and bear with me. But yeah, so data sharing from farms to government, look, that's really important. And at the end of the day, the data is owned by farmers. Right? I think for government and for local government as well, so this is across regional and central, it's really being clear to farmers what that data is going to be used for and how they're going to make sure it's secure as well. So I think if farmers know what it's being used for, where it's going, and who has access to it, then you can share that data across the different platforms.
It's really important, particularly for a farmer who might be sharing data with private sector and public sector. So, Christina, just a question around how do we make sure that farmers maintain ownership rights, or how do we make sure they can retain some degree of control over what data they hold or what data they have custodianship of? How do we make sure that happens properly?
Yeah, I think so at Balance we sort of split that farm data up into two separate camps. So we use the concept of commodity data, and that might be the skeleton of a farm map where all the paddocks are. It could be how much nutrients were applied on the farm. But then there's some of our IP data, and that's the stuff that Balance wants to protect. So we're really happy to share and allow farmers to permission that commodity data between organisations. So that's why we've recently been involved with the Trust Alliance and really like this concept of using a digital wallet to put it in the farmer's control to enable that consent of data flow between organisations. At the moment, we have to have sort of opt-ins within our UI. So as we were speaking before around sharing data to government, we have to be very clear that when our farmers submit in their N reporting at the end of the season, our dairy farmers, that they understand where that data is going and how it's going to be used.
Yeah. And there's a lot of sensitivity around, for example, nitrate emissions and particularly in the dairy sector. And one of the key things I imagine is making sure that farm data is protected and making sure that farm data is released in a manner that makes the farmer feel good about collecting it in the first place. So when the farm data goes to the government, and I'm going to bring in Lucy and Sam into this series of questions, how do we make sure that we protect that farm data? What are some ideas coming out, Sam and Lucy, either of you can answer this, around how we make sure the farming data is secure as it moves across to the government agencies?
I think actually that if I may go first here, that what Christina was saying is actually the cooperation is actually what will help so much, because if we work together and make clear what is being asked for and how it's being provided, that's vital. But I'm going to put a different spin on it though as well, in the sense that I think in a few years and even in a few months, the importance of where the data was originated is actually going to become so much more important than we realize today, which is why, digital farm wallet, verified credentials and actual sort of independent technology of the source of the data is going to become so hugely important, because we will have to know that we are getting the right data from the right area in order to make the right decisions, right? So I think we are sort of, we talk about ownership of data, which anybody that knows me knows I really think is not the right way of wording that. It's the custodians of data, or the rights to data, is, yes, a very important question, but I think the authentication of the data is going to become really, really important. The definition and understanding the data, what in language, what it means, is going to become so important. If any one of you have been using AI recently, you talk to the AI, and that, if you ask for something from AI, you have to actually know what you're asking for. And that is going to become such a huge, important part. Where is it from? What does it mean? And is it actually verified? And can you trace it where it's being used? Sorry, over to you, Lucy.
So if I could bring in Lucy into this to frame a question to you, Lucy, around this. issue of protecting data to make sure that it's used properly and it's transferred appropriately. Is that something that MPI has got any thoughts around, or has got any ideas around where this might lead to in terms of how we protect data for farmers?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris, and it's really important that we do protect that data. I mean, we're working with different companies on this, so like you guys is one, but it's not just from a government perspective, right, that we protect that data. It's also our downstream customers, because there's a lot more requirements being asked for what's happening on farm, not for government, but actually your downstream customers. And an example I use quite regularly is Nestle. So Nestle is one of Fonterra's large customers, right? And by 2030, they want to halve their emissions, and by 2050 they want to be net zero. And when you're looking at their emissions profile, so 30% of those emissions come from the sourcing of dairy and livestock, which means that they want to know what's happening on farm, right? How are we reducing those emissions? And so that data needs to be going all the way through different customers, governments, all sorts of different groups to get to the consumers, because at the end of the day, it's the consumers that want to know this information, right? And so to protect that, I think actually what the digital wallet and what you guys are doing at TANZ is really good, and having that verified tool that can bring it through that series of groups.
Thank you, Lucy. That's a really good answer there. So I'm going to go back to you, Christina. Mm-hmm. So how do we've got obviously the tools that we can use to protect data. Mm-hmm. We've got these new emerging threats and opportunities in AI. Mm-hmm. But how do we extract value? How do we get value back to the farmer? Because isn't there a risk here that we've got too much data floating around, and how do we make sense of it, and how does the farmer actually end up finding it useful? It's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. At Balance, we kind of look at it from two perspectives. So we want to basically create recommendations of nutrients to be as sustainable and ultimately, enabling the productivity of the farmer as much as possible on a low greenhouse gas or water impact perspective. So that means that any information that we can get in relation to, say, the production of the farm, so we've just recently integrated with Fonterra, that really helps us understand, are we recommending the right amount of nutrients for that production of the farm? So we think that there's something in that optimising the farm system that really is useful to our business specifically, and the farmer ultimately benefits from that. But then we also think that there's value to the farmer in passing on that sort of end footprint into the supply chain, so then the farmer can, through their suppliers, extract more value at the end and promote themselves as a premium supplier and, sell their produce for more on the market.
So in other words, what Balance does in terms of tracking that in application can then be transferred to Fonterra, who can then link that to the milk output, who can then link that to overseas trade, which goes to Lucy's comment about Nestle wanting to know the emissions. So this linking data together in a sequence, is there any, and I'm going to go to Sam on this question, because how do we make sure that we link this data together and we make it coherent, that the rest of the world can look at it and make sense of it? How do we fit into the standards worldwide that are emerging, Sam, in your view? Because you spend a lot of time in this area. What are some of your views about what's happening internationally?
Well, I think internationally we are all a little bit lost because everybody is doing it a bit siloed. But I think we need to figure out a way to speak to each other and be clear to each other what we are referring to when we are talking about data. And I mean, I worked with Christina on the NCAP, for example, and she will know, that graze pasture doesn't necessarily mean graze pasture, and synthetic nitrogen fertilizer doesn't necessarily mean synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So we have come up with an idea to create a platform for data definitions where people can basically come together and share what their platform or their area of study is actually using the language and data for. And I think that's one step. But there is any cooperation between, trust alliances and the EU and various bodies that are working on this. I think bringing them together and talking about this and finding these platforms where people can know what is being shared and how, that is how we will solve it, just step by step.
So let's just spend a bit of time on this data definition thing, because that's the bit that I find really curious, is that we don't really have a common data framework in New Zealand for farming. And is that something that's creating a barrier to sharing data between these different parties? I'm going to ask Lucy about this from an MPI perspective. Is having this data sort of broken into different silos, not being able to be shared because of a lack of common data definition, causing any problems? Is that a real issue, do you think?
Yeah, so Chris, this will be my personal view, because I have just done enough field scholarship, so that's meant that I've travelled the world last year looking at this particular problem around data interoperability. And I completely agree with Sam. The key is data definitions. So there's a lot of talk about data standards and having everyone have the same standard for a farm as a farm, right? But that just means that you're going to have to create relationships across everyone who defines a farm. Right? Whereas if you've got just data definitions and you've defined and said how you're calculating or what your definition is for that farm, you can then manipulate that and like bring the data together using APIs and other tools like that. So I think Sam's completely right. It's data definitions we're focusing on rather than data standards. Data standards makes it quicker in the long run, but you need to build all the relationships up front for everyone to agree that that's the standard we're going to work towards. So that's my view on that.
Okay, so let's just talk about this data definition for a moment. So what the panelists, I think, are telling us here is there's not a common set of farm data definitions in New Zealand. I find that a bit strange, to be brutally honest. And how did we get to this point? Just curious, why isn't there a book I can pick up that's got all the standard definitions in it? Did we never do that at some point, Christina?
Oh, so there's international standards,
yeah.
But New Zealand, true to its nature, is an innovative place, and there are lots of sort of pockets of innovation that might have been happening independently, and so there wasn't that sort of governing definition or standardisation, I guess. So like we call a paddock something that another organisation would call a field, which could be something else totally entirely in another organisation, and so that's kind of the largest challenge when we integrate, is making sure, are we talking about the same thing here? And then once we've got that established, then the rest is a lot easier.
Okay, so that's in the private sector. So just skipping across to Sam, because I know, Sam, this is an area of passion for you. Is there different definitions of what a paddock is and a farm is across the country, inside government, both central and local?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
But I just wanted to state, though, that we shouldn't be too harsh on ourselves either, because I don't think any industry has really cracked this. I mean, if you go and buy shoes, or any clothes, you're never going to find standard sizing on anything, right? So farming is complex, and because it's small businesses and it's, you go everything from, growing strawberries to having milking cows to having fish, it's very different things that you're doing on farm and different land and different soil and different areas. So it's a complicated area. And a lot of people have done a lot of good work in creating standards for individual areas. So you will find, there are standards for GIS and data link. They did a great work on data standards, which was something people could pick up if it fit them. You have all sorts of people out there that have done a good job. And within government, they try to come out with policies and they define what is required in each policy. But there simply hasn't been, sort of this from top to bottom, if you like, where you would say, if I'm going to have, paddock in my policy, I will have to double check all other policies in the country, because that would be, impossible, or was impossible, but it's getting more impossible now. But I know for a fact that this work is now ongoing, both in MFE through the NPF, the National Policy Framework, and National Policy, National Environment Standards and stuff, for the upcoming reform of the resource management. There is a lot of work going on in this field, and I'm not to speak for Lucy, but I know that MPI is doing similar through integrated farm planning and the Digital Agriculture Council and other working groups.
To hear, Sam, that at a governmental level, and Lucy, just quickly to you, is that something that MPI is looking at as well, is this data harmonisation and standardisation, just to pick up on Sam's comments?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So yes, as Sam mentioned, the integrated farm planning is a key example of that. So we are trying to bring all of that information together. So it is easier for farmers to make those decisions on farm, and it's not just for compliance reasons, the data. And yeah, so yeah, that's my view there too.
Okay.
Just quickly on the integrated
okay.
farm plans, the standardisation, absolutely agreed that it's needed, but say in our case we have an existing integrated farm plan solution, and I'm sure we meet some of the standardisation needs, but others we won't, and so then there's that cost of all getting onto the same page with that standardisation or making sure that those data definitions do match. So agree that it's needed, but the cost isn't insequential. Yeah.
So we've got about a minute 30 left, so I just want to wrap up some final comments from you, Christina. Anything that you'd like to share with the viewers today about the value of farm data and what the future looks like?
I think ultimately it needs to make farmers' lives easier in ag. There's no point unless it's going to solve something for them. So yeah, focus on the pain points, truly understand the farmer, and probably apply some human-centred design principles to enable that. Yeah.
Great. And very quickly, Sam, if you could, in a nutshell, sort of...
Just two things. First of all, if you are working in this space, reach out to the ecosystem. If you are in a silo currently, talk to towns, talk to anybody, try to integrate yourself to know what's going on, because there's so many projects around this. And the other thing is just remember, there's a huge difference between data standards like ISO and just being very clear on what you're talking about through data definition. Lean on the data definition. Thank you, Sam. And very quickly, last words from you, Lucy.
Yes, I completely echo what both Christine and Sam have been saying. And also, just very quickly, so data, it needs to be useful for farmers to make decisions on farm, so you can see it holistically, but also downstream for the compliance and for consumers, so they know where things are coming from. I mean, we're in the information age, so everybody wants to know everything.
Thank you so much, Lucy, Sam and Christina. That's all from today's panel, but on behalf of the Trust Alliance, I'd like to thank New Zealand Agritech for putting on today's video presentation.
Thanks, Chris.